why did Palestinians get such a pitiful deal at Oslo, whereas on the Egyptian front there was a full withdrawal in the Camp David Accord? And it really is a question worth pondering. If you look at the Camp David Accord, or let's just backtrack a little, beginning in 1971, Sadat, the president of Egypt, offered Israel a full peace in exchange for a full Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. Similarly, the Palestinians, since the mid-1970s, have been offering Israel a full peace in exchange for a full Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza. And then the obvious question arises: why did Egypt get the full withdrawal and the Palestinians got a full zero? Some people would want to claim security, that there are basic security issues on the West Bank which didn't arise in the case of Egypt and the Sinai. That, alas, the historical record shows, is flat out false. Because you must remember that the war in 1967 did not break out on the Palestinian-Jordanian front. It broke out on the Egyptian front, in the Sinai. And Israel maintained from 1967 to 1973 that it has fundamental strategic interests in the Sinai, in particular the area called Sharm el-Sheikh, which it can never, under any circumstances, even a full treaty, abandon. As the famous remark of Moshe Dayan put it, we prefer Sharm el-Sheikh without peace to peace without Sharm el-Sheikh. So Israel was claiming on the Egyptian front also basic security interests. It's not as if security issues arise in the West Bank that didn't arise on the Sinai front. They did. One need only go back and look at the record. I don't want to plug my book. Professor Sigler did a good job of that. But I quote at length, to the point where people found it, my friends, my editors, found it tedious, because it was literally every other month. Israel kept insisting, we have fundamental security interests. We must keep a third of the Sinai and Sharm el-Sheikh. So the answer can't be security. As we all know, Ben Jonson once wrote that patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels, and security, as we all know, is the last refuge of scoundrel states. It can't be security. Well, what then accounts for Israel's full withdrawal from the Sinai, but not from the West Bank? And the answer, unfortunately, it's unfortunate, but it's obvious, that Egypt went to war in October 1973, and it proved itself to be a military power that had to be reckoned with. Up until 1973, Israelis suffered from this kind of purblind triumphalism. The claim was made routinely in Israeli literature that the Arabs, or to quote Ezer Weizmann, war is not an Arab game. Arabs don't know how to fight. That was the inference from the June 67 war. And Israel assumed it can have its way everywhere where it had conquered territory because the Arabs are militarily inept. Well, the October 73 war proved otherwise on the Egyptian front. the Egyptian performance was, by military standards, not ones that I care to even quote, but they were remarkably impressive. Everybody acknowledged that, and Israel realized it had to sign a treaty with Egypt because Egypt was a formidable power. And it was quite obvious what the terms would have to be. They would have to be a full Israeli withdrawal. The point being that in 1993 at Oslo, the Palestinians were in obviously a pitiful situation for a whole number of reasons that all of you are familiar with, I suspect, ranging from the collapse of the Soviet Union to the petering out of the Intifada to the disaster, the Gulf catastrophe, and so forth. The Palestinians had no cards to play, and Israel did what every conquering power does. Namely, Israel, like every conquering power, only understands the language of force. And in 1973, the language of force compelled it to make a full withdrawal. In September 1993, all the force was on their side, and they did what any conquering power would do. They imposed a settlement that gave them everything. There's also one other useful comparison between the Egyptian Accord, the Camp David Accord, and the Palestinian one. The Egyptian Accord, the Camp David Accord of 1977, runs to about 7 book-sized pages. The Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty of 1979 runs to approximately 10 pages. In very simple, lapidary words, it says, Israel will execute a full withdrawal, Egypt will sign a peace treaty. Very simple, very clear. Compare the 7 pages of Camp David or the 10 pages of the Israel-Egyptian peace treaty with Oslo II. Oslo II is 300 plus folio-sized pages filled with multiple annexes, appendices, clauses, subclauses. This is not a document or a blueprint for the emancipation of the Palestinians. It's a blueprint for their emasculation. And it's very obvious just by the sheer scope of this accord, and I might add, by its sheer absurdity. Imagine a peace treaty which proscribes the wording on postage stamps. Could you imagine, for example, Nelson Mandela signing a treaty like that? Its absurdity is almost mind-boggling. Well, that exhausts, at least to the extent that time allows, that exhausts the letter of the Oslo Accord. Nonetheless, it doesn't exhaust the topic of whether or not Palestinians will get something out of Oslo. Because you may wish to make the argument that although the letter of Oslo gives Palestinians nothing, and frankly there isn't a single Palestinian I know that disputes that claim, you may wish to argue that even though the letter of the accord gives Palestinians nothing, nonetheless, through the accord's provisions for a Palestinian council, a Palestinian police force, and so forth, maybe Palestinians will, in practice, be put in a better position to achieve true self-determination. The tacit assumption, the Pollyanna-ish assumption, is that any new reality must improve on the present state of affairs. Yet, the new reality will more than likely allow for the tightening of Israel's grip on the Palestinians. This is the Bantustanization scenario projected not only by Said, but even Israeli analysis like MERTV60. Benvenisti in his book calls Palestinian self-rule, and now I quote him, a euphemism for Bantustanization, and he calls the Oslo I Accord, and I call him again, a prolongation of the occupation by remote control. The remote control, of course, being the new Palestinian Authority. Well, how do you prove or how do you demonstrate that Oslo II in practice will lead to nothing? You obviously can't prove it. The most you can do is argue by analogy or look at historical precedents. And the most useful historical precedent is the one that I've already suggested, and the one that's suggested by the very terminology that Meron Benveniste uses, Bantustanization. Namely, let's look at the South African precedent and see how usefully it illuminates where events in the West Bank and Gaza are going. After World War II, South Africa faced basically the same dilemma as Israel, an ethnically exclusivist state which has an ethnically heterogeneous population. Like Israel, South Africa came after World War II under severe international condemnation for trying to maintain the rule of an ethnic state in an ethnically heterogeneous among an ethnically heterogeneous population. So the South African government, after World War II, under the leadership of Verwoerd, instituted a policy of separate development or apartheid. Verwoerd, the South Africans, they used the language of decolonization. They said the areas which they were withdrawing from, what eventually became the Bantustans, that these were colonies. We are withdrawing from them. We are giving the colonies independence. Originally, incidentally, they did not say independence. They said self-rule. They used the Israeli term, what subsequently became the Israeli terminology. Now, as some of you no doubt know, this is a very deceptive kind of decolonization, because South Africa kept for itself the lion's share of resources and left the South African blacks in a state of complete thraldom to the South African government. On the other hand, even though this is obviously an agreement which the South Africans would benefit by, or would seem to benefit by, many South Africans opposed the withdrawal and the creation of the areas of self-rule because in their view, not unlike the case in Israel, the areas of self-rule may become too politically powerful. They may become bases of what South Africans called Mau Mau terrorism and so forth. On the other hand, many sincere foes of apartheid at the beginning, just like in the Israel-Palestine case, supported the Bantustan project. They thought, to use Arafat's language, it would be a first step toward justice. So, in both cases, it's pretty much the same general framework. But the framework, it's not just a case of the general framework, it's also an exact comparison when it comes to details. I don't have time to go into all of them. I just want to highlight a few to show you what becomes very clear when you read the Oslo Accords, that either by intuition or by calculation, they are almost, in fact they are, a carbon copy of the accords that created the Bantustans in South Africa. That sounds like a tall claim, Let me just give you some examples. The Bantustans, as in this case, comprised multiple fragments of barren land. The South African government forcibly removed from the designated homelands white settlers who angrily charged that they had been sold down the river. The first homeland granted self-rule was Transkei. What was it given? I'll just quote to you, and you'll recall what I said about Oslo. Transkei was given a flag and a national anthem, like the Palestinians. However, it only had control over taxation, education, public works, agriculture, the courts, and welfare. South Africa reserved for itself jurisdiction, listen closely, over external and internal security, foreign affairs, communication, transportation, population movement. It retained a veto on all Transkei legislation, and it retained jurisdiction over whites within Transkei's borders. That is the Oslo Accord, in a nutshell. There's one crucial difference, though, one which I won't have time to develop now, namely that in the South African case, everyone, and I mean even the apologists of apartheid, acknowledged that the Constitution South Africa wrote for Transkei left them powerless. That is, they got nothing. Everyone acknowledged that. And the unfortunate turn of events in Israel-Palestine, how does the discourse read? Not only is there not an acknowledgement that Palestinians got nothing, but rather the contrary. A dove writes, Mr. Amos Oz, he writes, "We stop ruling you and suppressing you, and you recognize Israel and stop killing us. But until now, we have delivered and you haven't." In the Oslo case, the whole burden of responsibility has shifted to the Palestinians. Furthermore, exactly as in the Transkei case, or the Bantustan case generally, they created what were called growth points. That is, they tried to attract foreign investment with the incentive of cheap labor and tax concessions. Exactly what is now going on in the West Bank. They call them now industrial parks. And exactly in the case of the West Bank, only a handful of people actually benefited from these agreements. Now, there's one other crucial point which I want to emphasize, and that is South Africa did grant all the Bantustans full independence in 1976 in the case of Transkei and the others later. And that's a very important point. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the Bantustans. They were legally fully independent. Nonetheless, the whole international community, literally, there was a UN vote on it, condemned the Bantustans as a sham. The point being that, in my view at least, the likelihood is that Israel will eventually grant those pitiful areas from which it redeployed, they will grant them independence. The unfortunate thing is, in the Palestinian case, that's probably going to be viewed as a compromise and reasonable settlement. Whereas in the South African case, everyone understood it was a farce. Why was it a farce? For basically two reasons, and that's where I'm going to leave off because I don't have a time for a dialogue with the audience. Even the conservative critics of apartheid namely those who were generally sympathetic to apartheid, they recognized that even if the Bantustans were granted independence, it was grossly unfair, because South Africa took everything and left to the indigenous African population what was worthless. Everyone understood the transparent unfairness of that compromise, even though the Bantustans were fully independent. Again, the remarkable fact is Israel's seizure of everything worth taking from the West Bank and Gaza. The only thing they left was the people, because they don't want them. They want the land, they want the water, they want everything useful, but they don't want the people, because they don't fit into a Jewish state. In the case of Israel, Palestine, that's considered or viewed as a fair deal, a compromise. Whereas in the South African case, it was transparently seen as fakery, a sham, and a disgrace. Let me just quote to you, I want to just quote, this is not just my opinion. Let me quote to you again MERTV60. Referring to Oslo, he states as follows, referring to the terms of the accord. While Israel is free to act independently in its own sovereign area, it insists on coordinating the usage of natural resources by the Palestinians, so that Israeli interests will not be harmed. This asymmetry perpetuates the existing inequality in the distribution of common natural resources, and re-emphasizes the impression of a victor's peace. Listen to his last words. For the Israelis, it is peace without pain or sacrifice, a bargain proposition. They gave up nothing, they took everything. In the South African context, that was readily understood to be unfair. But Palestinians who now, and it's shameful but it's true, who now rank in humanity's great chain of being, they rank below South African blacks. The fact that they're conceded nothing, absolute zero, nothing, that constitutes, in the discourse of Israel and Palestine, a fair compromise. Well, as I said a moment ago, that was the conservative critique of apartheid. But there was also a radical critique of apartheid, the one which eventually proved to be more prescient. That critique was that apartheid simply could not work. The reason being that the areas set aside for the indigenous African population and the areas set aside for the white population were so closely connected in every meaningful sense, historically, economically, socially, demographically, that you can never, in any meaningful sense, separate out the reality of the Bantustans from South Africa. Simply put, as some of you no doubt know, South Africa was totally dependent on Bantustan labor, and the Bantustans were totally dependent on work in South Africa, and, as I mentioned earlier, the financial grants of the South African government. Simply put, that means that the Bantustan arrangement, or apartheid generally, was a fiction. You could never, in reality, unscramble the whites and the blacks in South Africa. And the fact of the matter is, in my view, the same basic reality obtains in Israel-Palestine. So to quote Ben-Venisi again, I'm quoting him because he is the former vice mayor of Jerusalem and the recognized authority in the West Bank and Gaza, and also remarkably honest.